Thank you very much, Joan, for that slightly misleading introduction to someone who may no longer be a socialist, but still vibrates to Marxism. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I think I'll be able to be reasonably terse, given the very heavy artillery that follows me on our side. I think it might perhaps have been felt when I was chosen that the case for atheism should not be made by the spokesman for its moderate wing, Richard Dawkins. It might be okay to have at least one extremist on the panel. And I'll begin at once by recalling an exchange I had recently in Colorado Springs with a spokesman of America's evangelical broadcasting wing, a much overrated but nonetheless significant force in American politics. This broadcaster asked me, in response to my own statement of unbelief, he said, "I insist that you answer the following question, and that you answer it with a yes or a no." I braced myself. I accepted the challenge unseen. He said, "You are to imagine yourself in a strange city where you've never been before. You are to imagine nightfall coming on, and you to be without friends or succor in this town. And you are to ask yourself whether you would feel safer or less safe when you saw a dozen men coming towards you in the dusk, if you were to know that they had recently come from a prayer meeting." This is I think I can justifiably say I'm relaying to you, comrades, friends, brothers, sisters, the challenge that was put by the religious to me. You'll see at once it's not a yes-no answer. You can't give a yes-no answer to that, but I accept it anyway. I said, very well, I won't give a Sesame Street reply, but just without leaving the letter B, I have been in that situation. In Bombay, in Belfast, in Beirut, in Belgrade, in Baghdad, and many other places too. And I won't tell you about all of them, but let me just, as it were, fill in some of those latent blanks. In Belfast, the capital city of one of the provinces of this, our United Kingdom, as everybody here knows, everything, culturally, educationally, economically, politically, socially, has been very gravely retarded for at least a quarter of a century. At least half a century and maybe more since partition, and before that, because partition is both the outcome and the cause of sectarian warfare in this town, by the simple fact that there are people there who are willing to kill not just one another, but one another's children on the basis of what kind of Christian they are. Horrible things are done, not just in pubs and clubs, but on the streets, on housing estates, on university campuses in that city still, despite the relatively good news we've had today, where the situation remains dominated by barbaric sectarian party leaders. On this and no other basis. Both churches demand that their children are sent to separate schools. They each agree with the other that above all things, their own children must be protected from the faith of another faith. I don't think I need to elaborate very much more on how horrendous the consequences of that have been and how they are enshrined, by the way, in our own constitution, which mandates that our own head of the church is also the head of the state and of the armed forces, with all the ludicrous Windsor consequences that you get if you found a national church on the family values of Henry VIII. These conditions, which are farcical in England, Wales, and Scotland, are tragic and ugly, only a few minutes flying time from where we sit. If I pass on from Belfast to, say, Baghdad, where I've recently been, and without reopening any of the arguments about the rightness or otherwise of the coalition intervention in Mesopotamia, I think it can be granted by any fair-minded person that what was most needed in Iraq after 30 years of fascism and war was a period of reflection, a short interlude of calm, during which Iraqis could look about themselves and decide perhaps for whom they'd like to vote, perhaps what kind of country they'd like to live in, what kind of federal system they might wish to evolve, and to do so unmolested by violence or terror. The parties of God have vetoed every hope of that process. The parties of God now have the Iraqi people in their jaws, and they're saying to them, it's not enough just to kill foreigners or to rail against Jews or Christians or secularists. That's nothing like enough. It's only in Iraq, not only, mainly, chiefly in Iraq, that it's considered perfectly all right, in fact, a religious duty to blow up the mosques, to destroy the religious schools of other Muslims, of the Muslims of another school, not unlike the pattern of Belfast. It's not enough to have faith, you must have the right version of your own faith, or risk death, mutilation, and humiliation, and the destruction, the immiseration, the torture of Iraqi society is something that all of us can read about every day. Suppose we're to go to Beirut, the pearl of the Levant, the most civilized and beautiful and cultured city of the Middle East, and to see what happens when, for politicized reasons, a sectarian constitution is in place which says that the president of Lebanon must always be a Maronite Christian, that the speaker of its parliament must always be a Shia, that its vice president must always be a Sunni, that the Druze must have their share, and so on, leaving out at the very bottom, I'm afraid, such forces as Kurds and Armenians, but making everyone defined in their citizenship by their faith. Do I need to elaborate what that's done to retard, to bankrupt, to beggar, to disfigure, and to degrade what could have been an ideally plural and diverse and happy society? Remaining with letter B, shall I say Banja Luka? Shall I say Belgrade? Or just say Bosnia? Again, one of the most civilized enclaves of the Balkans. For many years, protected by a secular constitution and the remains of what had been a secular and democratic republic. And just look what happens when it is decided that it is a matter of faith that determines your citizenship, your allegiance, your identity, your nature, your rights. See the recrudescence in the Europe of the late 20th and early 21st century of Catholic fascist parties we thought we'd left behind at Nuremberg, the Ustasha. The recrudescence of forces like the Chetniks, the Serbian Orthodox fascists who took exactly the same view except the other way around. See the craven way in which our spineless media, which always defers to people of faith, say that it was Serbs who shelled Sarajevo or Croats who shelled Mostar, when what they should have been saying was, today the Christian Orthodox militia bombarded an open city around the clock, or yesterday the Catholic forces shelled Mostar from dawn till dusk. They didn't do it because it's a matter of taste. We're supposed to respect people of faith, and we're supposed to respect them while they do that and do that and make this sort of excuse. There aren't enough words, in my lexicon at any rate, to express the contempt that I think any right-thinking person must feel for this conscription of this kind of medieval barbarism. Joan will tell me when I've got a minute. I don't know whether I'm yet trespassing on my rivals and my allies' time, but if I was to add Bombay to this list, the city that was very nearly ruined by the sectarian partition of India in 1947, 1948, where once again people were told it's a matter of faith what kind of Indian you are. You may have to become a Pakistani if you're Muslim. You may have to lose your life on the proposition. You may not just be a Hindu. Bombay more or less survived this, the terrifying ethnic cleansing and the pogrom that ensued when the subcontinent was mutilated and maimed and partitioned on this basis in the hopes of a genuine Indian unity and independence, ruined by way of appeasement of people of faith. But Bombay sort of recovered until recently, when now its name has been changed, its minority citizens persecuted, intimidated, driven out by a new Hindu nationalist party, the Shiv Sena, that says that, again, if you do not follow the right God, if you don't accept the supernatural as a real force in everyday life, you are not worth whatever it takes to become or to remain or be treated as an ordinary, democratic, civilized human being in, again, one of the great cities of Asia. Now, it's not part of my case, and I'm sure it's not part of Professor Grayling's or Professor Dawkins's either, to say that religion is the reason for all of this, or the exclusive or sole reason for all of it. I think it would be crude and reductionist to say that. But who is going to argue, I'll be fascinated to see, Who is going to argue that the matter of faith, that the religious allegiance, that the preachings of religion have not in all these cases gravely exacerbated, gravely deepened, gravely poisoned and prolonged all of these things that have made our tenuous civilization extremely difficult to defend, uphold, maintain, let alone to advance? I don't believe this case could be made. That's for a simple reason, because religion is not provided to us by revelation. It doesn't come from the heavens. It doesn't come from the beyond. It doesn't come from the divine. It's man-made. And it shows. It shows very well that religion is created, invented, imposed by a species half a chromosome away from the chimpanzee. It shows, doesn't it? Well, why do we deceive ourselves on this point? And is there anywhere, I'm now going to wind up, is there anywhere of the places I've mentioned, and I exempt Basra and all the other B's I could take you around, where it wouldn't be enormously welcome if there was a mass conversion to secularism, or a mass adoption of the secular idea and principle, of the principles of Bertrand Russell, who once spoke famously from this platform, of Thomas Paine, of Thomas Jefferson, of Voltaire, and others. And I'll close by saying that I want you to be on your guard against two false issues in this respect, and I'll be very brief. When I mentioned those gentlemen, and I could mention some ladies too in this connection, like Mary Wollstonecraft, don't let anyone tell you that, oh, well, secular tyranny is just as bad. After all, there have been fascist and communist dictatorships which have been just as revolting. Fascism, as you know, was supported by the Catholic Church all through its life, and in fact till after it had died, and still is defended by it. One of the leaders of the Axis was actually, the Japanese leader, was actually a god. There's no way of saying fascism and National Socialism when the Axis was secular. And in the case of Stalinism and Maoism and the Khmer Rouge, the same mistake is made, and a religion is made out of man. It's the religious impulse itself that I think we need to oppose, to criticize in ourselves as well as in others. The argument from faith, in other words, the argument from certainty. So those of us who maintain this may not be described, my closing point, as fundamentalists or secularists, as certain cheap and demagogic and opportunist forces have recently been suggesting. We do believe in evidence, we do believe in skepticism, we do believe in reason. We hold our views with as much conviction and principle as any God-botherer does. But we are open to the argument, and we're going to prove it tonight to you. And don't let anyone dare to imply there's a moral equivalence between us and the fanatics and the fools and those who think they know God's will and can tell you what it is, who are our enemies, and your enemies too. So, I beg to propose the motion that stands in our name. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot more than nine. Yeah.
The motion is opposed by Dr. Nigel Spivey, who is a teacher of classical art and archaeology at Cambridge. His books, which are many, include Songs on Bronze, Greek Myths Retold, and he has done several television series, of which one was called Digging for Jesus. Dr. Spivey.
The proposer of the motion began by saying he was putting the case for atheism. And with respect, Christopher, I'm going to start by saying this isn't a debate about the existence of God. It's a debate about us mortals, the crooked timber of humanity, and how the practice of religion in general affects us. Karl Marx famously described religion as an opiate. Jonathan Miller thinks it's more of an amphetamine, gets people overexcited, and my own meagre religious experience disposes me to think of it as a sort of anesthetic, by which I mean that when I am in situations of feeling lonely, sad, or frightened, I find myself crooning hymns that really relate to the place where we are. They're mostly Wesleyan hymns, but anything really that has the sentiment of Psalm 23 and helps one whistle and sing through the valleys of fear and death. But I'm not here to testify as a somewhat lapsed Methodist, but instead to deliver such academic expertise as I have to offer on this topic. It's brief, has to be brief, but in my view it is so compelling that when we arrive at the conclusion in 6 minutes' time, I'm half afraid that everyone will walk out. And I'd like you to promise not to do that. Otherwise, this will be an embarrassment to the organisers and to ourselves. I'm going to talk about archaeology and anthropology and start with the news from archaeology, the long-term view. Is that better? As far as we can tell, the species of Homo sapiens roamed the world for thousands of years before becoming, as it were, religious. Something radical happened in our minds, our cognitive systems, about 40,000 years ago. We started to make things for the sake of beauty, not utility. We started painting pictures, carving sculptures. We started using symbols, and that probably included talking to each other, making music, painting our bodies, and so on. This is referred to by archaeologists as the creative explosion. And it's a consensus that there's this kind of grand collective takeoff of our human capacities in the Stone Age, or the Upper Paleolithic to be precise. And one aspect here I think I ought to highlight, which is that one of the features that appears at this time, 40,000 years ago, is that humans start burying each other properly. And they start, with these burials, to put down flowers, gifts, and other signs of what we take to be some kind of succor or consolation, and possibly a belief in an afterlife. There is some debate about whether our doomed rivals, the Neanderthals, had these sensibilities, but the consensus is that Homo sapiens is a species uniquely hardwired for metaphysics. I've written about this in an understated book called How Art Made the World, and I'm not going to go on any more about it. But this archaeological evidence for the genesis of art, religion, and culture in the creative development of Homo sapiens is not easily discounted. And it sets up an evolutionary pattern. It explains why, I think, when John Lennon or Richard Dawkins asks us to imagine a world without religion, you find your mind wandering, and you're wondering what a world would look like without King's College Chapel, without the Taj Mahal, without Hagia Sophia, the Blue Mosque, the Parthenon, the Pantheon, the Sistine Chapel. Venice I've got down here, and I think just about all of Venice qualifies. And you become aware that even while Nietzsche in the 1880s was declaring that God was dead, at the same time you've got Van Gogh manically daubing away out of religious fervour, and a little later on that you find Kandinsky more coolly explaining why this nexus of art, music and spirituality made such an essential and indissoluble alliance for our quest for transcendental satisfaction. And it's why, when I'm asked to imagine a world without religion, it does tend to end up looking like, dare I say, a suburb of Swindon, with the only spire that pierces the sky is the Tesco's clock. Well, we've got a few minutes for the anthropology here as well. Once upon a time, there was a classics don at Cambridge who sat in his study, and he compiled a voluminous series of case studies gathered from around the colonized world about how pre-industrial societies kept up peculiar and primitive practices. So they cowered when the thunder started rolling, they danced for rain, they would copulate in the fields to ensure a good harvest, and so on. It's a literary masterpiece, this work by J.G. Fraser, The Golden Bough, subtitled A Study in Magic and Religion, and in Fraser's words, it set out to chart the long march, the slow and toilsome ascent of humanity from savagery to civilization. Beautifully written, but it's all tosh, and most anthropologists would say so today. In fact, it was not an anthropologist, but another Cambridge individual, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who made some remarks, offhand as it seems, about Fraser's Golden Bough, and pointed out that Fraser's method was fundamentally mistaken. Fraser supposed that savages, these so-called savages, made their sacrifice to graven idols, or they danced for rain, out of ignorance and superstition. But as Wittgenstein argued, the essence of ritual is performance, it's expressive. It's something that you can't gloss with a reasonable explanation. In Wittgenstein's word, we can only describe and say, human life is like this. Have I got time for an analogy? 1 minute, probably not time for the analogy. I was going to tell you about the risks of attempting to react violently to a computer when it does something stupid, which is based on the analogy that Wittgenstein gives of hitting the ground when you're angry. It's not because you think you're going to hurt the ground, it's because you want a release of rage. I will just briefly, incidentally say that it is a very bad idea to hit a laptop. William James, the American psychologist, showed a century ago that there is no logical connection to be made between the fact that our ancient ancestors made errors of scientific reasoning, mixed them up with their religion, and the conclusion that all religion is a big mistake. Logically, that just does not work. If I had another hour here, I'd like to expatiate on the extraordinary phenomenon of how one religion overlaps with another, and how especially the persistence of sacred behavior from the pagan to the classical world is something, the yew trees in the churches, the roots of the cult of the Virgin in antiquity, and so on. But I'm going to end up by saying that around the world, whatever we say here tonight, around the world, the sea of faith rolls on. It rolls on because faith is not some kind of atavistic relapse, but part of our creative and ingenious nature. It's a force by which we humans survive. And the conclusion is that this fact is attested archaeologically, anthropologically, psychologically, and, I dare say, neurologically. And the conclusion would be that for the next hour or so, can I tell you this? In a sense, we are wasting our time debating that we'd be better off without religion. It's not an option. Religion is part of our human makeup, and it's going to be a very interesting time that we spend, but essentially it's not a topic for debate. It's the way that we are.